we're going to start with a traditional tune from the klezmer repertoire. It's called Der Gassenlied, the street song.
Hello, Mr. David Krakauer. Thank you for your wonderful concert with Klezmer Madness. That brings me immediately to that name. Can you explain the name?
Well, I just thought the name actually was the title of my first record that I made under my own name. I had already made 2 records with the Klezmatics. And then when I recorded for John Zorn's Tzaddik Labor, label, I'm sorry, for John Zorn's Tzadik label, I decided that, you know, this is this mixing of avant-garde. I asked my friend, the pianist and composer Anthony Coleman, to join me, and he did this crazy piece with samples. And then he also did a collaboration with the great Yiddish singer Michael Alpert, a song about Chernobyl with these really confrontational factory noises. And so we had this whole kind of the atmosphere of the record was pretty crazy. So I thought it was Klezmer Madness. And then I thought, wow, well, you know, and I decided to change the name of the band. It used to be the Krakauer Trio, but that sort of limited it to a trio. I wanted to make a bigger band, so I decided to call it David Krakauer's Klezmer Madness, and that seemed more apropos.
How long does the group exist now in this formation?
Basically, I've been working with this group for probably since about 1996, 1997. So 14 or so years in a quintet version, yes. Sextet version.
Very good musicians. I mean, and they mix very good together.
Well, all of us have been playing a long time. I mean, the musicians are not always available, but I have a family now of musicians, like 3 or 4 musicians. I would say anybody I go out on the road with has played with me for a minimum of 4 or 5 years. So that this is a really great aggregation. They know the music, they know me, and I know them, and so we have a great chemistry. So-Called, I've been working with for the past 10 years or so. I met him in 2000 at a festival called KLEZ Canada, north of Montreal, and it's a place where klezmer people get together, and there's teaching and Yiddish and all kinds of stuff. And so the first summer, in the summer of 2000, So-Called was actually kind of a student and a researcher. He was very young at the time, in his early 20s. And, he was really coming from hip-hop, but trying to find his roots through the Yiddish music and find sources for sampling. And then that's where, he went. So the following year, I guess he had been working with that stuff. And then in the summer of 2001, he gave me a CD called the Hip Hop Seder. That's the Passover meal, the Seder, and there are songs, around that meal. And so I thought to myself, this is going to be the stupidest thing I'll ever listen to, because I thought, wow, how corny can you get? The Hip Hop Seder, this is going to be awful. And then I put it on, and I said to myself, wow, this is absolutely ingenious. So I asked him to first. I had a concert in New York at one of the chamber music concert halls, and I asked him to compose a sort of electronic suite for clarinet and electronics, and then that worked out very well. And then he started little by little to collaborate with me on my recording, The 12 Tribes. He does one piece, and then in Live in Krakow, he's doing 2 or 3 pieces, and then Bubamaisis, my 4th CD on Label Bleu, he was the full collaborator with me, and really we basically co-produced that record.
It's a French label, isn't it?
Yes, Label Bleu. And I had been working with Piranha in Germany with the Klezmatics, and I was a member of the Klezmatics from about 1989 to about 1996 or so. And when I left the Klezmatics to form my own band, I kind of just somehow, I had gotten an invitation from the French festival in Amiens, from the Maison de la Culture, because some journalists in France were writing about me, and they were very interested, especially in these records, these 2 records I made for Tzadik, for John Zorn. And so they were interested in this new klezmer and this new way of doing it. So I went to Amiens, and immediately I gave all my interviews in French, like 4 hours of interviews, and I hadn't spoken French really since about 1977. I was a student there in Paris in 1977, and I managed to speak French fluently, but then I came to France, Then this is 1999 we're talking about. So for, quite a while, like 22 years, I hadn't spoken French. And suddenly I'm giving all these interviews. And that night I played that concert. I met my agent, who is still my agent in France. La Belle Bleue invited me to be, to make records with them. So right away my French career was launched. And that's my biggest market so far. I'm looking forward to more opportunities in Holland.
Let's hope so.
Yes, I hope so too.
What did you study in France?
I studied music. I went to the Conservatoire National Supérieur de Musique, the Paris Conservatory, and I also I only spent 1 year there. I needed to get back to the States, but I spent 1 year there, and I studied like Greek and Roman history, and would go to the Louvre and study these beautiful pieces. But I mean, that was it was part of my college training. It was my junior year abroad, but I was able to study music and had a wonderful experience.
Maybe a little bit about your development as a musician. Your background is classical, isn't it? You studied clarinet in a classical way.
Well, I started studying, as a classical music, but I think the secret to what I do comes from the fact that I think it was good to ask about my musical training, because I think that that's key in a way, that I was doing jazz and classical at the same time. And so I did, I met the jazz pianist and composer I mentioned before, Anthony Coleman, yes. And we were in high school together. So, pardon me, I started to improvise with him, play jazz, and we were doing jazz repertoire way before Wynton Marsalis. So we were doing Jelly Roll Morton, Earl Hines, Duke Ellington, and then going all the way to original compositions new compositions of Anthony Coleman's. So I was playing with him in high school, and so passionately involved with playing jazz. But at the same time, my first teacher was a jazz musician, and then when I went to, and his name is Joel Press, and he's still around. He's just turned 80, and he has jam sessions almost every day at his home in Newton, and they actually call it the Institute. It's a kind of a Boston legend, because people come and play, and so he's an incredible jazz musician, a saxophonist, and he lived through that era. He told me, he'll say to me like, well, you never really heard Charlie Parker unless you heard him live. And I can imagine that. To hear that sound viscerally right up close in your face is one thing. To hear it on records is another thing. And so those kinds of comments, Joel would say I would cut school when he was in high school and go to the Apollo Theater and catch a show of Duke Ellington's, like a matinee show. So, and I was fortunate enough in the early 70s to catch some of the great musicians also at the end of their lives. I mean, Duke Ellington I heard several times at the Rainbow Grill in New York, and Charles Mingus, and then people like Joe Jones, Papa Joe Jones, the drummer with Count Basie in the 30s, and so I heard some great musicians, as well as the Art Ensemble of Chicago and Sonny Rollins, people who are still around, but
But those two worlds, I hear you explain that they went more or less parallel in your development, but aren't these worlds two totally different circuits?
Well, you see, this is what happened to me, because then in college, I sort of felt pressure from some people I knew, musicians, some maybe friends of my parents who were prominent musicians, and they were saying, you really have to focus on classical. If you're going to become a classical musician, you have to focus on it. And I guess I had a crisis of confidence at that point. I couldn't just say, I'm just going to be a jazz musician. I wasn't sure, because I worshipped the great jazz musicians like Sidney Bechet, like Coleman Hawkins. These were my great, great heroes, Coltrane. And so I thought, I'll never be able to make an original voice in jazz. So I quit playing jazz and when I was like 20. And that's about the period I went to the Paris Conservatory and I started really focusing on classical music. And I had this great teacher. But again, I was fortunate because I had a teacher named Leon Rushnoff who taught all the great symphonic musicians of that time in America. The first clarinet in New York, Stanley Drucker, and the first clarinet in Chicago, Larry Combs, and Frank Cohen in Cleveland, and Michel Zukovsky in Los Angeles. He taught all these great, soloists. Charles Neidig, a prominent soloist. So these were all his students, and then but at the same time, he was a really cool guy. He was very open. He was a Jewish communist, So he was very, communist in the sense of just politically left, I would say. In America, it wasn't that he wasn't like like super far to the left, but he was like a left wing kind of guy, and so he was just really an amazing person, like very open. And at the time, my parents, again, my late mother was a classical violinist, so she was like, what a my boy, he's playing jazz, he's playing saxophone, this is going to ruin him. And Leon Rushnoff, said, your son should study whatever he needs to. He should play jazz, he should do whatever, because the field is difficult and you should be as versatile as possible. So, he gave that green light. And also, by the way, he also not only taught all those symphonic players, he taught all these like Broadway players, and he taught Jimmy Hamilton, who was Duke Ellington's clarinet player for many years. And so,
So that was a very important person in your life, in your musical life.
Absolutely. Very, very important. And, then, like in the late 70s, actually this teacher gave me some sheet music, some pieces for clarinet and piano that were arranged by his teacher. His teacher was Simeon Belleson. And Belleson had come from Tsarist Russia, then was the principal clarinetist of the New York Philharmonic from like 1920 to 1946. And Belleson was also very passionately involved in Jewish music. He played in an ensemble in St. Petersburg called Zimro. And he was also played in the movie Green Fields, Grüne Felder, very famous Yiddish film from 1937, directed, of course, by the great Edgar G. Ulmer, who did some of the great film noir like Detour, some of these crazy low-budget film noir classics. And Ulmer is also one of my great heroes. So somehow Ulmer and my teacher and my teacher's teacher all converged. Simeon Belleson can be heard playing the clarinet in Green Fields. And it's very classical, but it's Jewish melodies and coming from this St. Petersburg tradition. So it sort of skipped a generation. There was my teacher's teacher, and then there was my teacher, and then me, again, passionately interested and engaged in Jewish music. But that came about, he gave me these Belleson pieces in the late 70s. I was able to hear Dave Tarras, the great klezmer master, who was quite old at the time, but he played one note and I got goosebumps, but all of these little things sort of lay dormant in my head. But then in the late 80s, after years of this questioning, I wanted to play improvised music again, and I missed playing jazz, and I felt like I had made a horrible mistake leaving jazz behind, but I was very confused. I didn't know what to do, and suddenly in the late 80s, basically through a series of chance meetings and coincidences, I started to play klezmer. And it was this weird thing because there was a klezmer band outside of my window. I used to live on 80th Street and Broadway in New York City. And there was a klezmer band that used to play in front of the Jewish delicatessen Zabar. So I'd hear them. And I kind of said, wow, that's really nice. And I don't know, and I remembered hearing Dave Tarras all those years before and some other things. And so then one day I ran into the woman who played accordion in that klezmer band, and I just recognized her, and I saw her and on the 104 bus in New York, and I said, "Hey, you play accordion in that klezmer band?" And right, you know, yes. And then she said, "Hey, we're looking for a clarinet player," and she thought because I was an established classical musician that I'd sort of say, "Well, I have a student or a friend," and the words came out of my mouth, "I'd like to try." And it was from there I started playing with this very little modest klezmer band, playing in New York, and just for me, it was just for fun, to like a musical hobby. And I was also playing in a woodwind quintet that had won the Naumburg Chamber Music Award, and I was playing with all sorts of, you know, different groups and stuff. And
how old were you then?
I was in my early 30s. And so, you know, I was going all around and doing all these sorts of things, and, you know, but I just thought I'll play klezmer for fun. And then I was doing that, and then about 8 months later, the Klezmatics heard about me, and that was it. And I started playing with the Klezmatics, and then I formed Klezmer Madness, and then now we're sort of up to date. But, you know, also with the Klezmatics, we did one record with Itzhak Perlman. In the mid-90s, I recorded with the Kronos Quartet, Osvaldo Golochov's Dreams and Prayers of Isaac the Blind. We performed that at the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam, and, you know, so we in the big hall, of course, and that was an amazing experience. And now I'm collaborating with new composers. Kronos is trying to cook up a new project with me. I have, there's a young Polish kid named Vlad Marhulec who's written a concerto for me, which I premiered with the Detroit Symphony. He's like a 23-year-old Polish with Jewish origins, you know, composer. And he wrote this like brilliant, ingenious clarinet concerto for me, which I hope to play all over the world. But for now, we premiered it in Detroit last December with that amazing orchestra, Andrew Litton conducting. So we've got a lot of things, you know, a lot of irons in the fire.
Of course, if one sees the concert of Klezmer Madness, as we did over here, of course, one can hear that it's klezmer music, but it's modern klezmer music. It's music that's that one can hear. It's developed together with how time develops and how other kinds of music develops. But in klezmer, as you have in tango and as you have in flamenco, there are purists who say you can't do that. Is it also in klezmer that there are purists who say you can't modernize it?
Well, sure, there are purists everywhere. There's police everywhere. Jerome Harris calls them, you know, the gatekeepers. They're watching, you know. But, you know, it's interesting. I see the whole world sort of as, let's say, the klezmer world as a kind of ecosystem. There are people doing it, let's say more or less more historically, quote unquote, traditionally, kind of reconstructing from an idea of old, like 1920s, 30s records, or even turn of the century records, based on, you know, musicological research and so on and so forth. I certainly did my homework, listened to a lot of old klezmer, trying to get the spirit, but right away I always felt that it was important for me to let it mutate, and let the influences, all my influences that range, you know, from Coltrane to, you know, Bechet and Armstrong, from the great African American jazz tradition to, you know, funk and rock and experimental new music, and, you know, my like working in the downtown scene and free improvisation and all of these things to come in, but at the same time, you know, respect the tradition. I mean, you know, I think like tango, you know, you get things like, I mean, like the Gotan Project. I love them. I think they are doing something really amazing with tango. And you know, at the same time, it's very, you feel the tie to the tradition, but you feel like they're doing something new, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think you know, that klezmer music, I feel like our tradition, because was broken, the Jewish tradition was broken because of the Holocaust, of course, and Stalin suppressing. You know, I can't go back to my grandmother's village and study klezmer. I mean, I was in my great-grandfather's town, Bielsk Podlavsky in Poland, and I met the widow of the last Jew. The widow of the last Jew. That's important, because what do we have left? A few buildings, a few memories. So if we're going to preserve this tradition in any way, the most loving thing we can do, I think, is keep one foot in the past and one foot in the future. And then in the middle is this gulf, broken tradition. And then, of course, the third aspect is Americans wanting to assimilate. My grandparents stopped speaking Yiddish. They had so many hardships and problems in Eastern Europe. They were done. So they were like, no, we're not going to speak Yiddish. And so, you know, we move into the future with this music. So I feel sorry for the purists, actually.
You once said, I'm very afraid of, well, I paraphrase, maybe I paraphrase wrong, but I don't want klezmer to become a museum kind of music.
Yes. I think, you know, it's interesting that now, strangely enough, you know, I was part, of course, of the radical Jewish culture movement with John Zorn, and my record, Klezmer Madness, that I spoke about before, was the first of the radical Jewish culture line of the Tzaddik. That was the #1 radical Jewish culture record, and now he's made many, many, many. And also the, you know, in 1992, I was part of the Kristallnacht piece, played at Art Project in Munich. So, strangely enough, now in Paris, there's a big exhibition on radical Jewish culture. So, my faxes, letters from Zorn or whatever, they're in the museum. But, you know, it's work that I've done. And I'm not done, and I'm not done, and I'm going to continue on. So-Called and I are collaborating with Fred Wesley, the trombonist with, you know, James Brown and Parliament, and we're making this music we call the band Abraham Incorporated. So we're bringing Jews and African Americans together, and we're making some really interesting music. And I hate the word fusion, but we're mixing these things together. Fred calls it blendation. So, you know, we got this blendation going on and this mixing, and it's a good time, and people feel really good, and it's a bringing together of cultures. These are the kinds of things that I'm interested in doing, working with new composers. So the complexion, the tone, I think it's great to make new music. And sure, then we can have a program where, let's say, quote-unquote, historical klezmer could be side by side with Klezmer Madness, like the great clarinettist Joel Rubin. And he would do stuff kind of more in a sort of historical klezmer vein, but really trying to kind of find out things from the past and understand, and he does it in such a great way, so that a double bill, that happened once, a double bill of Joel Rubin and Klezmer Madness was beautiful. And so that ecosystem can work together. So I guess I'd say I do feel sorry for the purists, because the purists are limiting themselves. You know, it's funny, I played a concert in France once, and a very elderly lady in her 80s came up to me. She said, I lived in Poland, I grew up in Poland, I'm Jewish, I was hidden during the war, I grew up with klezmer music. And she said, and I saw the electric guitar and the drum set, and she said, I was absolutely prepared to hate what you did. And she said, but I see that you love this music, and you're doing it with your heart, and you're opening up and expanding it to the future, and I loved what you did. So she was ready to hate it, but she listened with open ears and an open mind, and, you know, that was it. And I think for me, I think that our band, you know, if we have a good sound mix and a good sound system, and everything can be heard, and there's so much musicality going on, that if you just like music, you know, there's something for everyone there. You know, and also we will do pieces, you know, let's say not perfectly purist, but like, you know, a Russian share, a dance tune. And then we do it, and then next to it we might do a more experimental tune. And so it's good programming. Like in classical music, you might say, okay, we'll put a Mozart serenade, intermission, Messiaen quartet for the end of time. That's good programming. Variety.
A few minutes ago you were talking, or you mentioned the spirit of klezmer. How would you describe the spirit of klezmer? What is the spirit of klezmer?
Well, I think, you know, there's a thing in klezmer, the relationship of klezmer to cantorial music. And so that, you know, there's a cliche about klezmer that it laughs and cries at the same time. So even when it's a happy piece, it's sort of sad. And I think that the sadness comes from these little sounds which they call krechts, like these little catches in the voice. Like da 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 da, little catches in the voice, and this is what the cantor. You hear a great cantor with that kind of sound. So it's that plaintive supplication that has to be in the music. So like if you don't have that sort of the doin or the kalabesetzen or the kalabevine and these sort of rhapsodic forms, quasi-improvised forms, are coming from the monophonic singing and chanting of the cantor, from the chant. And so though if you don't have that in the music, it's like if you don't have blues and jazz, you don't have jazz as far as I'm concerned. So if you don't have that plaintive cry in the music in that specific way, all great music has a cry. A great Beethoven quartet has a cry, but each music has its own cry, its own. And that's klezmer with these krechts and these little sounds and sobs between the notes in its own specific way.
But at the same time, it's celebration.
Yeah, it's dance music, it's party music. But there's that flavor inside it all the time.
You mentioned Quatuor pour la fin du temps of Messiaen.
Yes.
I've understood that you do, or maybe did, I'm not sure, a project around this piece of Messiaen.
Oh yes, you're up on your David Krakauer lore. We did a project with the cellist Matt Heimovitz called Akoka, and Akoka was the name of the clarinettist who was captured with Messiaen, and he was Jewish, and so his whole story was a little different from the others. So basically, we do a performance where we do an introduction, kind of a quasi-improvised piece that I put together, and we go right into the quartet for the end of time without a stop. You know, we don't mess around with it, or we play it. And then So-Called wrote a piece at the end, a kind of a coda with heartbeats and newsreels from World War II and all kinds of crazy sounds and a sort of a mad explosion of insanity, and so it's like this whole journey, and you're sort of thinking about one lone individual, Akoka, caught in this conflagration of horrible world events, and so that's kind of what Akoka is all about. Listening to the quartet for the end of time with new ears.
Maybe a question about the way you play. You beautifully play the clarinet. Wouldn't you say that the way you play it, of course, in written music, composed music, so-called classical music, is a totally different way of playing, as you have to play clarinet in klezmer?
Well, absolutely. I use two different mouthpieces, so that the klezmer mouthpiece has more of a cry. It's earthier. It's more guttural. It screams more, and you know, I can do all these bends and glissandos. It has all this flexibility, whereas the classical mouthpiece holds me in more, reins it in. The sound is rounder. So if I do Brahms or a Mozart clarinet quintet, you know, or something like that, I have that mouthpiece. So it's really like a different instrument. The klezmer clarinet is a different instrument.
So you have to be a little bit two different persons to play the clarinet the way you do.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like it's like I unscrew one head and screw another head in. You know, it's a different brains, I think.
Would you agree that there's some kind of new interest in Jewish music now?
Well, you know, it's funny. I don't know. It's hard to say. If you asked me that question in 1989, I would have said yes, absolutely. And when the Klezmatics came on the scene, there was a renewed interest in Jewish music. I think now with some of the things that So-Called is doing and some of the other bands with electronics, with the work So-Called and I have done together, and then also the work he's done on his own, you know, yes, this is a new kind of a thing. But you know, there was a sort of a very distinct, like, first klezmer revival with, like, Andy Statman, the Klezmorim, the Klezmer Conservatory Band, the first edition of Brave Old World, etc. And then with the Klezmatics in the late 80s, you know, this was a sort of a second klezmer revival where it was more, you know, electric. The first klezmer revival sort of copying the old records, the second one like almost going more in a pop direction, you know, as I said, more amplified, pushing the envelope a little bit more. Now I think we're in this other period. I can't really quite, it's hard to put, and that's good. It's hard to put it in a box, like, oh, there's more interest in Jewish music. I think people, or klezmer music, I think people are now saying, wow, these people coming from this tradition are doing these different things, and these composers are writing new pieces, and I think it's still sort of almost shaking out, you know, in a way. I mean, there is this thing with adding beats with like Balkan beatbox or, you know, Gogol Bordello or things like that, like adding beats to, you know, say traditional kinds of music and people doing remixes and sampling. But there's also this thing of new composers and people pushing the frontiers. So I think that, you know, as globalization is taking over the world, so globalization affects what we all do, and in an interesting way, I think. I think in an interesting way. So it would be dishonest for me to say, oh, I come from my little town, New York City, you know, my little town, you know, and all I heard was klezmer music growing up. You know, that would be nonsense. So I think it's about just trying to come from a very honest place of making music, and but a big part of my story is my desire to, you know, is and was in the past and continues to be my desire to connect with my tradition and my roots, but to reach out and do collaborations with all kinds of interesting people, composers, artists, different people. I hope theater people in the future, filmmakers, whatever. I'm open to it all. It's great to make new art that people like and that's interesting and that challenges them and makes them think and makes them happy. So we need some happiness these days. You know, we really do. You know, it's important. And I felt after 9/11, I always felt like the arts are more and more important for us. We need this. We need it so much, or the whole fabric of the society is going to fly apart.
Okay, maybe a last question.
Okay.
We were talking about new influences in klezmer, the way you try to, well, I don't know if it's the right term, but to try to modernize klezmer, or in even let klezmer be a developing kind of music. Would you say that let new influences come in klezmer is almost a political statement?
Well, that's a hard question to answer. Okay, well, political, you know, when I went to Europe in the late 80s with the Klezmatics the first time, and, you know, Europe, of course, was then and still is in the, you know, throes of dealing with multiculturalism and big problems with, like, neo-fascists and neo-Nazis and you know, people like Le Pen and the far right, you know, there's all this nonsense going on then. And so Jews, because Jews were the multicultural Europeans before the Second World War, suddenly to come and be Jewish and proudly Jewish, you know, we represent multiculturalism. So I think in that sense that without waving a flag, without being political, without being overtly political, without saying, you know, this party, this or that, we do make a political statement. So I think in that sense, you know, in adding the influences, that's what we do musically. I guess one person the other night in France said to me, I hear you come from New York because Jews breathe free in New York. And, you know, I think in Holland probably they do too. But in France, I don't think they do. I don't think they really breathe as free as we do in New York. And in other places around the world, you know, I said maybe New York is one of the great places, one of the great havens to be Jewish, and so many open-minded people together, and so much acceptance of, you know, whether it's Jewish or Muslim or Christian or black or white. You know, there's always problems and tensions, but there's so much acceptance really at the end of the line. At the end of the day, I meant to do the bottom line. The end of the day, there's so much acceptance, and so I think that yes, maybe that mixing of influences. I think, you know, I don't know. This is up to people to judge, not up to me to judge. But I believe that when I'm mixing the influences, it has a ring of authenticity. It doesn't sound contrived or like it's a collage of some sort. It's an honest working. That's at least what I'm trying to do, is an honest working of these materials. And that does come from being Jewish and being in New York and being a place where I can breathe free and not have so many like boxes, you know, compartments in my head, but more the compartments are more, the walls are sort of down. Maybe that's it. I don't know. You know, it's hard to judge oneself, but someone said that to me the other night, actually, and I was like, oh, that makes sense. So, but I certainly think that when we came, the Klezmatics, Klezmer Madness, coming to Europe, there was that political aspect. We are representing multiculturalism.
Mr. Krakauer, thank you very much for this long interview,
yes.
and I wish you lots of success with KLEZMER Madness.
Great, well thank you
Maybe
so
we'll
much.
see each other again.
I really hope so. It was great talking with you, and hope to see this somewhere, sometime.
I'll take care of it, that you can see it.
Great, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Yes.
Thank you. Cheryl Bailey on the guitar. Michael Serene on the drum. Jerome Harris on the bass. Rob Curto on the accordion. So Called on the piano, sampler.